Well, good morning. Welcome to the first video in the legislature module. This particular video will be introducing the idea of Parliament and particularly the House of Commons, its functions, what it does, how it works, who's in it. Later videos will be looking at the House of Lords, how laws are made, and most importantly, how well it fulfills any of its functions. Because remember, essays in politics will always be a debate. It will never say to you, what is the House of Commons? It will always be, well, is the House of Commons really more powerful than the Lords? Or does it do a good job at scrutinising the government or making laws or things like that? So, but before we can really kind of debate it, we have to be able to understand what it is and how it works. Now, this video, of course, is just going to be an introduction to the principles and what you need to know. So make sure you do your further reading. Your teacher, which will probably be me, will be telling you what you need to read this week to follow up. Pay attention particularly to anything you don't understand, but also any examples that you can use to back up these principles, because it's always important in essays where you're able to kind of say, well, this is what it is, and this is when it actually happened, to justify your view. So I want to start off by just kind of looking briefly at the history of Parliament, to how we've got to where we are. Parliament starts in 1265 with a kind of a dispute between one of the early kings and a man called Simon de Montfort, who is angry that the king is taking all this power for himself, and he wants to kind of make a kind of a counterbalance to it. And so they set up what had now come to be known as the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the idea is that the Commons, particularly, is supposed to give representation to the country. And it was, I believe, if I'm right, that two people were sent from every kind of area of the United Kingdom or the town, although it probably wouldn't have been the United Kingdom back then. But the idea is that people are sent from different areas around the country to bring their views to the king, and to also take messages back the other way. It was originally far more based around what we now call Westminster Hall. And if you look at the House of Commons, you probably think of if you think of the Houses of Parliament, we often think of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is that green benches and the red benches. But Westminster Hall, which is just to the side of it, is actually far older and was used far more as the original Parliament. We do still use it today, especially when people like Barack Obama came for his state visit, or when the Queen Mother died, she lay in state in Westminster Hall, and you can visit Westminster Hall. So that was the original Parliament, and it's still there today. It was one of the few things that survived the Great Fire of London and the Blitz and all that kind of stuff. It's one of the oldest buildings around there as well. And then Parliament kind of takes off properly from kind of 1272 plus. There's, at the beginning, the king, am I going to abolish it? Am I not going to abolish it? And in fact, the king actually kills Simon de Montfort and then decides he actually quite likes the idea of Parliament anyway, and kind of keeps it going. Now, it doesn't always sit, so sometimes the Parliament doesn't sit for a few years and then the king summons it, normally because he wants them to vote for a war or to kind of raise taxes or to kind of do something for him. But Parliament becomes a more or less permanent feature of the UK political system. Why? Because, well, they are there to kind of legitimise statutes. You should know statute law now. That's a key word from our course. To bring petitions from the people to the king, and that word again, taxes. A lot of parliamentary representation is to do with raising taxes or getting money from the people to pay for the king's latest war. Over time, elections are slowly introduced for these people that come into Commons. So when the Commons was first there were no elections. It was just representatives from the various places, normally fairly important people from those areas. But over time, it becomes more democratic. Now, please don't think all of a sudden we end up with everyone, one person, one vote in the year 1400, because that is not the case. The franchise, which is the idea that people get the vote, doesn't really become universal until the early 1900s. You probably heard of the suffragettes, but so women didn't get the vote until the early 1900s, 1918 to 23. It's that kind of period there. But for most men, they didn't have the vote either. It wasn't like men were voting for hundreds of years before women got it as well. It was mainly restricted to wealthy landowners or people that had some sort of kind of responsibility kind of within the community. But the principle that these representatives were democratically elected did slowly build up. And so the idea was that these were the democratically elected representatives of at least some of the people as time went on. Then we get something called the Glorious Revolution, which is 1689, which is where power really is transferred from the monarchy to Parliament. You've probably heard a term called parliamentary sovereignty, which we'll be looking at a little bit later in this video. But in effect, the monarch, the king or the queen, was sovereign in our country until the Glorious Revolution of 1689. So it's worth you kind of at least reading in your textbook just about what's called the Bill of Rights in 1689 or 1688, 1689. It's a kind of a time period. But this is where really the monarch gives up their powers and becomes what we now call a constitutional monarchy. They're there to be the head of state, to sign off laws, but really their involvement in the political process is very small. This also comes just after the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, and where you have the English Revolution beforehand, and the monarchy is actually removed briefly in British history, but then is invited back. So if you're interested, have a little look into it. But for our purposes, this is the point where Parliament becomes sovereign. But of course, there is still a House of Commons and House of Lords, which at one time were equal, like we have in the American system, where the two houses cannot overrule each other. But over time in our system, the Commons has become superior. You get the Parliament Acts of 1911 and again in 1949, which reduce the power of the Lords to be able to not stop legislation, but simply delay legislation and then delay it further. And so we come to our current situation where we still have two houses, but the Commons is clearly the superior one. It is now fully elected, and it is sovereign to the sovereign, if that makes sense, as in it is superior to the King and the Queen, who have very little power under our system. So let's just talk about what that word sovereign means. Now, the last bullet point that's about to come up here is actually probably the most important. So save space and don't think that the last one is the least important, but I'm going to go through what it means and then discuss the implications of it in the last bullet point. Parliament is sovereign. Well, that means, first of all, that it is Parliament that makes the laws. It's not directly the Prime Minister, although you could argue that in reality it's that, but it is Parliament that will create or get rid of or amend laws. It is the legislation-making chamber. We also have a weird system in our country that we have a fusion of powers. This is something we'll be exploring in class, and you'll see it especially in comparison to other countries. But our executive, our Prime Minister, is also a member of our House of Commons, our legislature. So rather than having what we call a separation of powers, our country has a fusion of powers. Our executive and our legislature are linked in some ways. They're not completely like this, but they are certainly like this. There is a strong overlap of certain individuals, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the government, and that is one of the key kind of tensions which is at the core of the British system, is how those two bits of the executive and the legislature, how do they interact when they are fused in some way, and where exactly does sovereignty lie with that being the case? The Parliament at Westminster is the sovereign Parliament for the whole of the Union. We do have a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Assembly and a Northern Irish Assembly and a London Assembly and various other mayors, but Parliament is sovereign to them all. Parliament is superior to them all. Parliament can overrule them all. One of the concepts I've talked about in class is this idea of legal sovereignty, or legal sovereignty versus kind of political sovereignty, like Westminster is superior to the Scottish Parliament. To what extent in real political terms are they able to overrule the Scottish Parliament? That's a debate. Like in reality, what can they do? But technically, they are completely sovereign. Westminster will always outrank the Scottish Parliaments and all of the others. And so that is legitimately it. The sovereignty of the King and the Queen was given to Parliament. And they symbolise that every time they open Parliament with the mace. The mace is that large gold object you can see there, and every time Parliament opens and MPs come in, they carry the mace into Parliament and they place it on the table. And you'll always see it on the table when they're debating and discussing. And the idea of this mace symbolises that the authority of the monarch is now in Parliament. And there have been a couple of occasions where various MPs have picked up the mace to be angry about something, or an occasion where an MP has picked it up and tried to remove it, saying Parliament is not doing the will of the people, and kind of taken it out. But it's definitely a symbol of sovereignty lies in that mace, and therefore lies with Parliament. The executive is also accountable to Parliament, and what I mean by that is they have to answer to them. If the executive does something, in this case Boris Johnson, then they can expect Parliament to question them about it, to investigate them about it, and maybe in some cases even try and remove them through something called a vote of no confidence or by calling a general election. So ultimately, Boris Johnson and his ministers, and whoever is Prime Minister when you're watching this video, must answer to Parliament. The ability of Parliament to call them to account is debatable. Like, it isn't just like Boris Johnson's boss is Parliament. You could argue actually the relationship is the other way around. But technically, Parliament is sovereign, and therefore the executive must always answer to it. Now, this is my key bit. Parliament is omnicompetent. There's a nice kind of keyword for you. Now, what does this actually mean? It means that it's all-powerful, not in a kind of like deity, godlike way, meaning that it can make snow fall out of mobile phones or whatever like that. But it means that nothing is more powerful than it, both in the past and in the future. And what this means in practical terms is that Parliament can make or break any law, and it cannot bind its successors, and it cannot be bound by its predecessors. Let me give you an example. It means that Parliament today cannot make a law that Parliament tomorrow cannot undo. Parliament tomorrow will always be able to undo anything that has come before, including something like the Human Rights Act, or Brexit, or un-Brexit, whatever that might be. And likewise, Parliament today can undo or change anything that has come before. It is omnicompetent. So the Parliament that exists right now, whenever now might be, has full control and full power over the political system and can change any law, any right, amend anything, as long as there is a majority in the House of Commons, which makes it very different to countries that have a constitution or a kind of a different separation of powers. Our Parliament is always powerful, omnicompetent. So what do we actually have in Parliament? I've already mentioned the terms House of Commons, House of Lords. House of Commons, the green benches. House of Lords is the red benches. And Parliament, when I use the term Parliament, that contains both of those houses. The House of Lords and the House of Commons together makes up Parliament. Technically, you should add the Queen as well, although the Queen is not. You kind of say, well, you know, is there a room in Parliament called the Queen? No, but the three parts together is what creates our legislature, our law-making body. In the Commons, there are about 650 MPs, depending on how many of them are sitting. Like, they don't all sit at one time, and it's possible that that number could change. There are various plans to try and reduce the number of MPs in the House of Commons, but as of October 2020, there are 650. In the Lords, there are over 775, and it changes because the Lords are appointed for life, and there's technically no limit to the amount they can be. So they can constantly create new Lords, and some of them die, or I don't know if you ever resign from being a Lord, really, but once they stop being a Lord, that's fine. But there's no election, there's no end of term limit for the Lords, and so you can just keep adding Lords in as the government wishes or the committee wishes. Whereas the Commons, there's always the same number, and then you have an election, and then that number is replaced or re-elected as it wants. Which brings me to this one, that the Commons is completely elected. There is no one in the House of Commons that is not elected, including the Speaker. There's a few kind of officials that sit in Parliament, but they aren't part of the legislature themselves. They might record things, or they might kind of be there to kind of do a particular job, but in terms of debating and voting, everyone there is elected. Whereas the Lords is mainly these days appointed. They're called life peers, appointed for life because they had a particular skill set or a particular set of experiences or the government deemed to be useful. And there are still 92 hereditary peers. In a previous week, we've talked about constitutional reform. There used to be a lot of hereditary peers, people who were born into that position. But now there are only 92, and they're far quieter than some of the others. In the Commons, you are elected once every 5 years, and I put an asterisk because technically, according to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it's 5 years, but political reality is it could be 2, it could be 4. We'll look at this when we look at elections, but then the amount of time between elections changes in the UK, unlike America, where it's fixed at 2 years, 2 years, 2 years for the House of Representatives. Lords, life terms. Whether you're a life peer or whether you're a hereditary peer, you are there for life, which is hopefully quite a long time. So the two houses are very different in terms of who is actually in them. And then, of course, that affects their, what we call legitimacy, it affects their role, but technically they are both law-making chambers and revising chambers with similar but not identical roles. I can't see what that is because it's just gone behind my head. Oh yes, in the Commons you get one person from each constituency. So this school is in Gerrards Cross and I can't remember the name of the local place, something or other. And I live in Watford at the moment, and so Watford has its own MP, and Gerrards Cross has its own MP, and Uxbridge has its own MP. So, but the idea is that one person comes from each place in the country. If you've got a place with a small population and another place next door that has a small population, then you might get them put them together. Like Brighton and Hove, for example, I believe has one MP for both those places. Likewise, if you have a place that has a huge population like London or Manchester, then you might get many MPs from the different areas. So for example, Harrow in Greater London has an MP, and then next door Wembley, that is also part of Greater London, has its own MP. So it's always based on population. It's tried to be divided up fairly, so roughly speaking you get the same amount of people represented by each MP. Whereas on the other side, he says, going back to his this time, the members are not elected and they are not from a constituency. They are there because of their expertise or their experience in certain areas. Each constituency represents about 70,000 people. It does change because population changes. People move, new towns are made, and one of the debates in Parliament that's been going for the last few years now is what should the current division of what we call boundaries be, and where should MPs kind of come from. But that's going to be a constant debate because population is always going to be moving, and certain towns will be growing and other towns will be shrinking and so on. There is no direct accountability or representation in the House of Lords, meaning you cannot remove a member of the House of Lords, like you and me as the people. We cannot. There are methods to remove them if they break the law, but if you just don't like them, there's nothing you can do. Whereas if you don't like your MP and you live in their constituency, then you can vote them out if enough of the constituency wants to do so. So when we look at the House of Commons, which is that green bench one, who is actually sitting on those benches? And I found this diagram online, which I think quite nicely explains it, especially going back to that term fusion of powers. Now, here you can see, excuse me, that was my emails. Here you can see the blue benches and the red benches. The blue benches represented here are the government, or I think the diagram's slightly back, but slightly... actually, you know what? I've grabbed the wrong diagram, but go with me here because I want to make a point. Let's say that the blue benches are the government and the red benches are the opposition. So in this case, the blue benches are the Conservative Party and the red benches would be the Labour Party, which is their normal colours. The bit in yellow, I think in the diagram, is actually supposed to be the Liberal Democrats or the SNP. But I want to call the bit in yellow the government, because the government is part of the biggest party. So in the House of Commons at the moment, you have all the Conservatives sit on one side of the House of Commons, like they are doing here. And the government, which is part of the Conservative Party in there, also sits on those benches. And they sit on the front benches, which is why they're often known as front benches or the cabinet or the government, which is why Boris Johnson and his cabinet will always sit on the front benches of their particular side. And they are Conservative MPs, but they are also the government. But sitting behind them, you have Conservative members who are MPs, but not members of the government. Yes, they are on the same side politically, but they are called backbenchers because they literally sit on the backbenches, and we'll be talking about them a little bit more in a second. So where people sit in the Commons tells you about their role in our political process. You have the front benchers, who are the members of the government. You have the backbenchers, who are not members of the government, representing their political party. Everyone that is on the government side all sits on one side, whichever party happens to be in government. And then everyone else sits on the other. So, for example, right now, on the non-government side, you will have Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and the DUP. You know, they're all going to sit on the same side because they're all not in government. And on the other side, you've got the Conservatives. When Labour is in government, Labour sits on the government side and everyone else sits on the other side. The only exception in recent memory was the coalition government under David Cameron, when both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats together sat on one side. So where people sit matters. Let's just go into that idea in a little bit more detail. This diagram is a little bit more kind of complex, but it shows us what we've got. So in the House of Commons, just focusing on the House of Commons here, the government, you can see that box there that says government, is part of the House of Commons. They are the Prime Ministers, the Ministers, and the Whips. And they are part of the governing party. And then you also have that box, backbenchers, which is part of the governing party, but not necessarily part of the government. This is quite a tricky concept to get. There are Conservatives in the House of Parliament who are not part of the government, but they are still part of the governing party. And then on the other side, opposition parties, shadow ministers, whips, and backbenchers, and we'll come back to them in a little bit, and we'll discuss about their role. House of Lords has a similar setup, but we'll talk about the House of Lords separately at another time once we've understood the Commons. So the next few slides are going to be called Parliamentary Parts. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are different sections or different people in Parliament with specific roles. And I want to talk about backbenchers first. What do we know already? Well, we know that each one comes from a constituency elected by the local people. We know that they're likely, highly likely, to come to be connected to a political party, most of them Labour or Conservative, but there are a few others there as well. And they are, in theory, they can act as they please. They can question whoever they want, and they can vote however they want. However, most of them, most of the time, will vote with their parties. So if their leader of the party says, vote yes to this bill, then they probably will. If the leader says vote no, then they probably will vote no. But technically, they are independent and can vote as they please. They are the ones that will ask questions of the executive at Prime Minister's questions and submit questions when there are urgent questions. They are the ones that can try to influence and amend legislation, and they are the ones that represent you. Wherever you live, you probably, unless you have a government MP representing you, have an MP that you can contact. Send them an email, go and see them. They hold surgeries. They will help you if you're having issues, or will try and help you within their limits. They can even raise your issue in Parliament, perhaps, if it's particularly important. But these are the people that decide whether laws are passed or not. And if a government wants to get something through, and by through I mean make a law, then they need the backbenchers, or the majority of backbenchers, to vote for it. So what these people think and how these people act is important. And to that end, there is a very suspicious, sneaky crew in Parliament called the government whips. And actually, the whips exist on both sides. It is the whip's job to make sure the backbenchers vote the right way. So if I was a Conservative MP, then the Conservative whip, who in this case is a man called Julian Smith, in this beautiful photo here, would be coming to tell me which way I needed to vote. And at the beginning of each week, I would be given a little document that would appear in my pigeonhole, or probably by email these days, and it would tell me which votes I needed to vote for, turn up for, and which way I was supposed to vote. And there's a thing in politics called a 3-line whip, which is if there's something there that says you must vote for this or against this, and it's underlined 3 times, then I got to do it. That is a direct instruction from my whip. Now, do I have to obey the whip if I'm a Conservative MP? Well, technically no. Politically, yes. And we'll talk more about this in the future, but if for me to go against my own party, I would be called a rebel. It might affect my future career, it might affect my ability to get re-elected, or it might just get ignored. I guess it depends on what I rebel over and how often I rebel. I guess it depends how much I like my leader, or how much I think he might affect my future kind of job prospects, or just how much I kind of believe in what they're saying. We will be looking in class a bit about the mind of an MP and how they kind of act. But I've got some videos that I want to show you about the whips specifically, because they can be more powerful or less powerful depending on all sorts of different circumstances. Julian Smith, bless him, he was the whip when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and he didn't have a good time because he was the guy that was responsible for getting Theresa May's Brexit deal through. He had to persuade Conservative MPs to vote for Theresa May's deal with the EU, and they didn't want to. And so, unfortunately for him, he failed in his job of getting the Conservative MPs to vote for it, which is possibly why he looks so stressed. However, most of the time whips are successful, and that's why most of the time the government is able to pass new laws, even when it's controversial. Recently, as of what are we on now, October 2020, there was an issue where Boris Johnson wanted to technically break international law with a bill he put through Parliament. And he got it through, mainly because the whips were able to persuade enough Conservative MPs to vote for it. The Speaker. The current Speaker is on the right-hand side here, which is a man called Leslie Hoyle. But the most famous speaker of the last 10 years or so is John Bercow, who's on the left. He's no longer the speaker. And the speaker is kind of like the umpire. He's the man that kind of calls the people to speak, and he says, oh, it's your turn to speak. No, it's your turn to speak. He almost famously says, order, 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 whenever he needs to. But he's actually more powerful than that. And under John Bercow, the speaker did become more of a political figure, because the speaker can do things like choose which amendments get voted on for a bill. So say the government writes a document and says, we want this need to be the new law. And then some MPs say, well, actually, we want to change this bit, and this bit. It's actually up to the speaker to decide whether they will debate those amendments and vote on those amendments. The speaker has also other powers where they can tell the government, no, we're not going to do that bill because we've already done it. Or can even tell the government off for breaking rules. Leslie Hoyle the other day actually told Boris Johnson off for not bringing new restrictions to Parliament first and advertising it to the media first before bringing it to Parliament. So the Speaker sometimes is a fairly neutral, fairly invisible role, and sometimes under John Bercow is a very controversial role because of what he did during the kind of the Brexit discussions and debates. Definitely a case study we'll be looking at further. And lastly, in Parliamentary Parts, there is an opposition. We'll talk lots and lots about the government, but this is Keir Starmer. He's the current Labour leader, and he is also a part of Parliament, and an official part of Parliament. He's given an extra salary, a specific place to sit. He is always given certain amounts of questions to ask at Prime Minister's questions and all those kind of things, because our democracy has decided that it is important that we question and have an opposition to whatever the government is doing. I remember David Cameron once said, he went to China and he was making a speech, and he said, if I wasn't here today, I would be in Parliament and I would be being questioned and held to account by the opposition. And he, I'm sure it irritates him irritates him personally, but I liked the fact that he defended the fact that our system includes opposition built in. Unlike certain countries where it is built in that the government is always right, our country builds in the idea that there will always be an opposition, someone saying, no, that's not right, that's not going to happen. So I've been going about 26 minutes now, so I think I'm going to stop this video here and then make a second one talking about the functions of Parliament and some of the other aspects of it. So you probably now want to go and read up on what I've just said, finding more about those kind of people, maybe read a little bit about John Bercow and the kinds of things during Brexit. Go look up that glorious revolution and the Bill of Rights a little bit more. If you didn't understand what I was saying about whips and backbenches, then I've probably put some resources on Firefly so you can watch some videos about that. Take your learning further and then come back for the next video.